Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Sheila. And first and foremost, I just want to say on behalf of our entire Breakthrough News team, I'm very honored to be here with such an august panel of individuals across the country here to launch Pivot to Peace. I think this is an absolutely critical initiative for all of the reasons you've already heard so far on this program. The relationship between China and the United States going into the 21st century is really one of such great import when it comes to all of the major challenges that are facing the world today, whether it be climate change, public health on a global scale, income inequality. I mean, really, what the relationship between the United States and China ends up being will have a profound impact, not only on the people of the United States, not only on the people of China, but really on the people of the world. So this is a question that is extremely, extremely critical. And it's been famously said that truth is the first casualty of war. And I think that we've already seen that in the context of the rising Cold War atmosphere against China. I mean, the free flow of information is the basis of empowered political activity. And already in the media climate in the United States, the disregarding of Chinese sources, the accepting of essentially any claim, regardless of the veracity of many of the individuals that are putting it forward, really the journalistic standards that you see here. And this is really consistent with what we've seen throughout the history of the United States in past Cold Wars and past hot wars, is that what immediately happens when things get divided between us and them, enemies and friends, is that the perspective of the country that has been deemed the adversary is completely and totally wiped out. But how can anyone in America make a valuable judgment or make an informed judgment on what the policy of the United States should be towards any country, but certainly towards China, without real knowledge of what's going on in China, what the perspectives of Chinese people are, how the Chinese diaspora around the world historically, and including in this country, has developed as an important part of the history of the United States. This is not just a question of the next 100 years, but it's a question of the past hundreds of years and a relationship that's been forged, the importance of Chinese Americans to the culture of so much of this country. I mean, there's so much rich history, rich context on both sides of the equation that if they're completely unknown, of course, will not enable anyone to make an informed judgment. And so from the perspective of what we have seen in our work at Breakthrough News, is it's been critically important to do what we can to try to get beyond the headlines, to try to go into that which should be known and which is unknown about all of when we see the racial slurs being used around the COVID-19 pandemic. It's so easily picked up in many ways because there's almost no real knowledge of how the pandemic, or what we know so far, quite frankly, because we don't know everything, about how the pandemic has developed, about how different countries responded. And in fact, China's response, which the whole world has praised as being so robust, has now become widely known in the United States as somehow being laggard or behind or deficient in some way, almost a complete flip on what the actual facts show us when we examine the record when it comes to what we've seen so far with this global pandemic. So we can see, I think, in just these few examples, just many of the things that you've heard here tonight, which are things that many of you may be saying, I wish I had known that before. How did I not know that? That's very important context for me. And the fact that that isn't in the mainstream of what's being discussed in this country is the problem. And the problem really is rooted in the fact that even the media has been swept up in this war hysteria. And rather than an objective look at the facts, we have attempts to blame and attempts to turn people against one another, both in between countries and in between those of us here in the United States as well. This is a poisonous issue of racism that often flows from any war that has happened in this country's history. And certainly in the Cold War here rising, we're seeing racism against anyone deemed to be Chinese rising here in this country, which should also deeply, deeply concern us. And the roots of this are so diffuse. I could say so much about it, because really the relationship between the United States and China, as I said at the outset, really touches at the core concerns of what kind of world we're going to have going into the 21st century. One of cooperation, where there is peace between nations, where the major challenges facing us as human beings, as a species, are confronted: climate change, income inequality, poverty. I mean, so many of the things that we know, war in general, that afflict this world so terribly. Either we're going to have a century that moves beyond that, a century of cooperation, or a century of continued war and continued deprivation. And I think ultimately the only way for us to avoid that is a strong, free flow of information, a strong understanding. And I think all those of us who are journalists, it's obviously our role to be able to provide the information for average everyday people to know what's really going on, to determine for themselves what sort of policies this country could be pursuing. And certainly from my own point of view personally, I think that would be a move away from a warlike mentality. So again, I'm very honored to be here, very happy to be able to participate in this launching of Pivot to Peace. I think that all of this information, I hope you use your own voice and your own social media to share this with other individuals that you know, so that we can start to break down the barriers of misunderstanding between the United States and China. Thank you so much.